Hello, wonderful. Do you like conflict? I doubt it. But we have to deal with it. We have to manage it.
Mm,
And there's different ways of dealing with conflict and
yeah,
real consequences if we avoid it. So we
right.
have Reneau Peurifoy. Hello, how are you again? I'm so glad to have you back on the podcast.
Doing great out here in sunny California where it's 100 degrees now.
Oh gosh. It's getting a
uh,
little cooler here in Tennessee. It's a
yeah.
bit nicer. Yes, it's a bit nicer. So I know you have quite the background
Mhm.
in conflict management and understanding this. Can you tell people where you're speaking from?
Well, I started out working, my main practice was working with anxiety disorders and primarily with people with panic disorder, although I did a lot of related stuff like OCD as well. And you work with them, and then you start getting the spouses and the other half coming in, and a lot of times you deal with a lot of conflict and figuring out how to deal with that, it becomes an issue. And you mentioned that people don't like to deal with conflict, and actually conflict is a normal part of relationships. If you think about it, whenever two people are together, I want to go have tacos, you want to go have Chinese food, I want to watch this, those are conflicts, right? If you're dealing with a reasonable person, usually you can resolve those in a friendly way, right? The problem comes when you're dealing with non-negotiators or people that are immature and unreasonable. So,
So describe a non-negotiator. I think that's going to pique the interest of my listeners.
well, let's first of all look at conflict along a line. And at one end of the line, you have a non-assertive behavior. And basically, I take care of your needs and I ignore mine. At the other opposite end, you have the aggressive way of resolving conflict. Essentially, I'm going to take care of my needs. I don't care about you. You know, in the middle is that what we usually call assertiveness, where we look for some kind of a mutual agreement, something where you get a piece of the pie, I get a little piece of it. And of course, that is a line, so you can slide up towards the aggressive or slide down to the non-assertive, depending upon the relationship and the situation. And one of the myths that people who teach assertiveness often have is that you solve everything that way, and that's not true. Uh, there are times when being non-assertive are appropriate. If the police officer is telling me you need to move along, I just comply, right? I'm not assertive. If I'm talking to my mom back when she was getting older, there's some things about mom that are just, she does them those ways and she has opinions about society and things that, I may not agree with. And rather than get into an argument, I value the relationship. So I just change the subject and I don't deal with that. And that would be a non-assertive approach. But that's okay because again, I value the relationship and it's not a whole lot on me. There's not a lot of disadvantage to me. I'm not that don't have that much emotional energy on it, so that's okay. And a lot of times in friendships, you deal with that with issues that are not big issues for you. In fact, that's part of mature people as they deal in couples, right? I'm sure, like in your marriage, my marriage, there's things where my wife's just funny that way.
My
So
husband is obsessed with how to load the
yeah,
dishwasher. It is, and I was talking to my daughter and I said, "You and Ben are so much alike." And she said, "We're not alike. I do things right." And
yeah,
I was like, "Oh my gosh, Ian, that's exactly why you guys are alike. There's a right way to wrap a present, a right way to
yeah,
unload
yeah, 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 yeah.
the dishwasher." And me and my son are like,
Yeah.
"So,
Really, really.
what did you do
Yeah. Well, one of the fun things in my marriage early on is my wife and I cook differently, and I would cook a lot, especially when the kids were young. And my mom was German background, so you clean up as you go, you soak things and that type of stuff. My wife, she comes in, she just trashes the kitchen, leaves it, and later on, when she feels like it, she gets back and she cleans it up. And for a lot of years, there was, it would be a lot easier if you would just soak it. You don't have to scrub it so much, all that type of stuff. And finally, we came to the realization, okay, nobody's going to change. So if I'm cooking, you stay out of the kitchen. I'll cook my way and I'll clean up. If you're cooking dinner, that's fine. I'll just stay out of the kitchen. I won't look, and I'll just eat whatever you serve. And that worked out. So
Uh-huh.
yeah. So yeah,
And
there are those situations.
I want people to hear the example of conflict that we both used, right? So
Uh,
Ben knows I'm not going to change in how I absentmindedly load the dishwasher. So he just comes behind it and
yeah.
reorganizes it. And I think, what a waste of time to worry about the
Yeah.
dishwasher. But if that's what you want to do, I don't say anything, right? And
Yeah.
because I think sometimes when that concept of marriage is hard,
Hmm.
and you and I are talking about, and obviously this is public forum, there's been
Right.
harder things. We're not saying,
Right. Right.
some of it as would not be appropriate to the privacy of our spouses. But I do want people to say, when I'm around people in healthy relationships, they're saying, oh, yeah, we have conflict. It's something like, oh, the dishwasher, or,
Yeah.
you're always 3 minutes late,
Right.
or it's
Right.
not name calling and throwing things across the room and
Right.
degrading behavior of, Sarah, you're such a piece of trash. No one will ever love you. Like when we
Right.
talk about conflict in relationships, that is abuse. We're
Right.
talking conflict, right? And I
Well,
really want
we're talking about with people who are mature and reasonable,
Mhm.
right? And have the capacity for intimacy and the capacity to negotiate in an appropriate way. And certainly that's not the case in a lot of relationships. Uh, so it's and the point is if you have that kind of a friendship or relationship, there are times when non-assertiveness is fine. Well, there's if you want the dishwasher loaded, then you just do it, right? Or if you want to cook, you just do it, and that works out because we're both okay with that. Of course, then you get the other end of the spectrum where the person is a non-negotiator, and if they're abusive as well, then essentially you have a couple different options. You're either just going to have to comply, you have to get out of the relationship. You can try an aggressive approach, and sometimes that works. A lot of times it won't.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, with a person who is real aggressive and they have a lot of anger issues, they have two things that they buy into for themselves that are not true. One is they'll think, well, I just can't help it. It's just the way I am.
Mhm.
And that's not true because they're not that way when they're around the boss. They're not that way when they're in court, you know. So they
Let's
can
stop.
control
I
their,
just pause right there,
yep,
because I have people all the time. Do they
yep,
know what they're doing? Can
yep,
they help us? And I want, if you're listening to the podcast, hit the little 30-second rewind or whatever. And
yep,
because they're not doing it in front of their boss, they're not doing it in front of people they're
right.
trying to impress, they're not doing it in court. So, yes, they can control it. Yes, they do know what they're doing, right? So,
Yes,
great point.
yep. And the reality is that it's an adult with a very small percentage of the population that have some genetic problems and other stuff like that, predispositions. But the average healthy adult has the capacity to control themselves, and they exhibit it on a regular basis. Uh, People who and they will only blow up or they'll only become abusive in situations where it's quote safe, where there's minimal consequences, at least with immediate ones. So that's one of the myths is I can't control myself. And unfortunately, oftentimes until law enforcement gets involved, that's the main motivator to where they decide, well, okay, maybe I need to start doing it in more than just at work or in other situations like that. Of course, the other myth is they minimize the consequences, right? It's no big deal. So what? So I yelled at her. So the kid, whatever. And that minimization of the consequence, it's kind of like having blinders on for them, right? They just this is the way I am. The world's not okay, and it's my way or the highway. That whole kind of mentality, right? And that's really difficult to deal with because a lot of times your only option is to get out. You know,
The biggest understatement of the entire world. I love that. You're like, yeah, that's not that
yeah,
easy to deal with, or that's pretty difficult to deal with. And it's like, it's like this
yeah,
map of like an avalanche of, yes, it is not
yeah.
easy to deal with. Well, and I
Not
want to
not
point out too that
one issue about that. One of the things that will keep somebody in an abusive relationship like that is you have to buy into the concept that I have rights. I mean, this is a big issue for me because when you look at women's shelters or other types of things like that, a lot of times women that come in from countries or cultures where women don't have that many rights, that's okay because I don't have any rights. Once they buy into the fact that I do have the right to be treated with dignity and respect, I do have the right to ask for what I want, that's when you see behaviors change. But the person individually has to who's on the receiving end of that type of behavior has to buy into the fact that I have the right to be respected, I have the right to ask for what I want, I have the right to be safe, those types of ideas. And that's very important.
hugely important and really
Yeah.
difficult. In the
Yep.
coaching program that I run, I have people say 50
Mhm.
reasons it's okay for me to have wants and needs. And that seems like a very basic
Yep.
question. And I, from a healthy place, would probably, I mean, okay, because I'm a human, because I try to do right by people, because I
Right.
ask for forgiveness, because
Yep.
I basic human rights. Because, I mean, that would be such an easy thing to say 50 reasons or 50 reasons it's
Right.
okay for your child to have wants and needs. But, you know, people struggle with making that list. And I said, do you see where the problem is?
Yep. Yep.
If it's okay
Because
for them to have wants and needs and not you,
yep.
do you
Because
see where the
until
problem
until you have that in your head, then
is?
you're not going to do the behavior,
Mhm, mhm.
and that's
And I
super super important.
and I also wanna point out, you were talking about some people being immature, some people being more mature, some people
Mm,
being, my way or the highway, and some people
mm,
being more, passive.
right.
Um, okay, I think one huge myth that we don't think about when we're dating and growing up and all
Hmm.
that kind of stuff, it's like, some people are better at basketball than others. We
Right.
can agree to that. Some people are
Right.
better singers than others. We can agree to that. Some people are better writers than others. We can agree to that.
Right.
Some people are better at being in relationships than others.
Hmm.
And we kind of assume, well, everybody's good at being a friend, or everybody's good at being
Right.
married, or everybody's good at, and it's like, what? Why? Who told us that? Why do we think that? Some people are not good at being in relationship.
Yeah, that's true. And you get into this whole issue of mate selection, right? And we choose our partner when we're young, at least. Hopefully, as we get older, if we get divorced, you learn how to do that better. But you choose the partner on an unconscious level. You choose what feels like home for the most part. And the way it works is, let's take a lady who's been in abused when she was young, right? Very crazy family. She gets in a situation, there's 50 guys out there, right? And they're all presenting well at that moment. She gets around the healthy guys, they feel funny because they have appropriate disclosure, appropriate boundaries, that type of stuff. She gets around people that have a similar background. There's something there feels like home, and everybody's presenting, so you really can't tell from the surface which one's which, but on an unconscious level, they pick it up. Where somebody from a healthy background, their little alarms start going off. There's something about this that feels funny. And so that's one of the things where if you come from that type of a background and you're not in a relationship currently and you're dating, you really need to get your conscious mind involved with evaluating this person. And this gets to something that I'm going to say that's extremely unpopular in our current day and age is you need to avoid getting into a sexual relationship early on. You
Mhm,
look at MRI studies of people who are infatuated, and they'll ask them, now, I want you to think about your partner. With women, the frontal cortex all shuts off. The reasoning stuff shuts off, and the emotion stuff turn on. So you want to delay that so that you can evaluate before you move to that level. And
mhm,
how do you evaluate somebody, whether they're going to be an okay partner? Well, well, first of all, you look at their family of origin, right? For a woman, she wants to look at the guy's dad or hear stories about him, right? With a guy, he wants to look at the gal's mom because a lot of that's going to be moving in down the road. It may not be there during the initial infatuation and courtship stage, but when things settle down, that person is going to move into your house, and you're going to look at him and say, "Well, wait a minute, where did you come from?" Right? But it happens because that's where they learned about relationships, right? That's where they learned about intimacy. That's where they learned about power. That's where they learned about conflict resolution, about role models, all that type of stuff. And so again, during dating, infatuation stage, people tend to present well, and then that other stuff kicks in later on. So look at the family of origin. And the other thing is pay attention to little stuff. What happens when the restaurant doesn't have what they want to eat, or they get their clothes soiled, or there's a disappointment of some type. How do they respond to that? When you have something where you have to negotiate, where you are differing, is that person able to negotiate with you in a reasonable manner? There's a lot of little red flags like that you can pick up early on if you're aware of those. And again, people who come from a healthy background just will automatically notice that stuff. People from a dysfunctional background, it's like they go into relationships with blinders on. This is what I'm used to, so this is normal, right? And until you get your conscious mind engaged and saying, well, look, wait a minute, let me take a look at what's happening here and evaluate it.
mhm. And my work, much of it centers around, I call it the that's weirds,
Uh-huh.
right? So I have a rule. So 3 that's weirds and you're out, which
Right.
is the little things that you pick up on, the little red
Right.
flags,
Right.
right?
Right.
So if it's like, I don't really know what's wrong, but something feels off, right? That's
Yep.
weird. You know, and if
Yep.
there's a pattern of those,
Yep.
um,
Yep.
but much of my work i- is in people talking themselves out of the that's weirds. And if you're with some
Yeah.
type of con artist, right?
Yep.
Oh, it's just because I'm stressed out from work that day.
Mm.
Oh, it's just because my ex-wife triggers me. And so then I have to call her a bitch. It's just
Right.
because, right? And it's like, ah,
Yep. Yep. Yep.
yeah.
And and actually, a lot of the research I've looked at, that's easier a lot of times for gals to do than guys. All guys can do it too, but there's something about just the caring circuit in women seems to be a little bit more active than the caring circuit, and that's an actual uh, neurobiological circuit inside of people. It gets counterposed with what's called the separation anxiety. That's why we miss people, when they're gone. That's why we, like to be around them when we see them, and that type of stuff. You see it in all different mammals, babies. It's been an interesting area of research that's been going on since about 2000. It's really kicked off the affective neurobiology. But yeah, you got to pick up on this stuff, and it's hard
Mhm.
because you don't want to believe it.
And I'm so glad you said that, right? So in my book, Becoming Toxic Person Proof, it's like, here
Yeah,
are 2 things, 2 beliefs that will save your life. 1, there are toxic people.
yeah,
2, you know them, right?
yeah,
You can get past that. Like,
yeah,
oh, I mean, all the
yeah,
bad, scary people are on nighttime TV,
yeah,
or,
yeah,
I mean, and that's how you protect your kids. And not
yeah,
everyone is toxic.
yeah,
There are wonderful people in the world, but not everyone is wonderful.
yeah. Well, yeah, and one of the big realizations for me way early on was that, adults are walking around with a set of core beliefs and core response patterns that a little kid came up with. And most people don't change a whole lot. You can, but most people don't think about it. So they go through their whole life basing their decisions and their reactions on a set of core patterns and beliefs that a little kid came up with. And that explains so much of the insanity you see in the world. There's a lot of very damaged people out there, and a lot of them are very successful.
Which is everything you're saying. And that's a good point. And that's a good point, right? Because
Yeah,
I do think people see, okay, if you're successful at work, that means you're going to be successful in relationships. And they require a different skill set
yeah,
sometimes. Is that
and
doggy?
people are very good at compartmentalizing behavior.
Yeah.
I worked a little bit with people with multiple personalities, and it was interesting because the difference between them and an average person is we track time between the different aspects of our personality. I'm different around my great grandchild who's 2.5 than I am around my wife, than I am around my friends, than I was at work or where I'm at church or whatever. And we do have different personas, and it's like different facets of a diamond that we just shine through at different times. And the human capacity for that ability to kind of shift our behavior into that particular circumstance, we call that uh, uh, a specific conditioning. Anyway, there's a word for it. It'll come to me in a minute. But anyway,
Mhm.
it is amazing how people do that.
And it's a bit of social intelligence, right? It's a bit
Yeah.
of good communication skills. If I'm talking to a third, well, I was talking to my 12-year-old before this thing, and there were funny stories, and we were talking about
Yeah.
funny things that happened in school. It would be an incredibly inappropriate conversation. What I would talk to a middle school boy about
Yeah.
is not the same thing I would talk to on a job interview, right? Like,
Right.
but it's not that I said something wrong. It's just, different communication skills. So
Yeah.
when people are one person in public and one person in private,
And
it's
and a
not.
lot of people get stuck at a young age.
Yeah.
And a lot of people that are abusive, a lot of times they are stuck at a very young age in areas of their life. And and there was, that's why we say an adult who's throwing a tantrum, they're acting like a 2-year-old, right?
Mhm, mhm,
Because
mhm.
2-year-olds don't control themselves. It's all about me, immediate need gratification. And some adults never grow out of that, or some
Mhm.
people never grow out of that as adults.
So I know that many of our listeners think, okay, if I get better at conflict, if I get better at
Mm.
managing those aggressive people, they will change their personalities.
You know, I saw a comedian a long time ago, and there's an element of truth to what he said, right? He was talking about guys going into a bar, right, and looking at the gals and saying, "Oh, yes, no, yeah, that one's pretty good." And then women come in, right, and they're thinking, "Well, there's a nice fixer-upper." So, and if you go into a relationship with the idea you're going to change the person, you've already doomed yourself to failure. Uh,
Mhm,
People can change over time, but number one, they have to want to change, and most people don't want to change. They like
mhm,
what they're at, or at least wise they're comfortable with who they are because it's predictable for them.
mhm,
And people like predictability.
mhm,
That's one of the reasons why people a lot of times stay in negative situations. It's not good. It hurts, but at least I know what I'm getting. If I change, I don't know what I'm going to get. And so that
mhm,
unpredictability is one of the things that people don't like. It's something about the way our mind is programmed is we like things to be predictable so we know how I'm going to respond, even if it's a negative or bad response.
mhm. And I talked to a lady this week. She was knew she needed to leave a toxic relationship.
Right.
And she was spending her day, she'd wake up and then she would read about narcissism all day. And then she would start drinking that night. And then she was
Mhm.
looking at ways to check herself into a mental institution because she thought it would
Right.
be easier to be in a mental institution than it would be to be in her current situation.
Right.
It's I have such compassion, because it is our brains trick us. And when we get that defeated, it's
Yeah.
very easy on the outside to hear that and say,
Yeah.
gosh, why don't you just leave? Right?
Yeah.
But
Right. And somebody who's oriented that way can see that. And this gets to something that I talk a lot about in the new book that's going to come out next year. It's our core response patterns. And a couple of classic ones are learned helplessness. And the other one is, do you have an external or an internal sense of control, right? A person with an external control, sense of control is they're just controlled by the events about outside of them. Whereas a person with an internal sense believes that, well, I can exert influence on my environment and create change and make things better for myself. And again, the learned helplessness is just, you take dogs, is the classic experiment. They would shock them until they would quit they would give up trying to escape from the shocks. They would put them into a new situation where they could easily escape and they didn't even try because they were so conditioned. And they've done this with a lot of different animals too. I know it's people who are animal lovers don't like to hear it, but people do the same stuff. People that, in fact, whole cultures, the Roman Empire, when uh, the lower class started having some freedoms, it took them a long time before they would get one of their own people into the Senate uh, because they didn't think they were capable of ruling themselves. And you see the same thing with people. Somebody who's grown up in a situation where there has been no possibility for them to have a better life or to exert some control, that's just their worldview, and that's their inner programming, their inner response pattern. Whenever conflict comes up, they just sit there and take it because they don't feel on that unconscious level that they can exert any kind of influence.
and we have to feel like we can control our circumstances or drive our circumstances,
Yeah,
not control everything, but it's like,
you,
okay,
you
if I
can you can influence things.
yeah, if I work
Yeah,
harder, I'll make more money. If I
yeah,
watch what I eat, I'll lose weight. If I spend time with my kids, I'll
mhm,
have a close relationship with my kids, right? Yeah, I
right,
mean, it can
yeah,
be things like that. A plus B equals C
yeah.
versus
Of course,
there's no such
we get back to that rights issue. Do I have a right to have a good relationship? Right? Am I worthy? The worthiness kind of gets mixed into it as well.
Mhm, mhm.
Yeah, maybe I don't deserve that.
So if you have someone who has learned helplessness
Hmm.
or they're very far on the end of the passive side of the conflict scale,
Hmm.
what steps can they take to get closer to the middle?
It's hard with adults. Now, with kids like who in the foster system who come in or maybe into learned helplessness, one of the things you try to give them, in addition to love and a positive environment, is a success experience. I saw a longitudinal study a long time ago about adults who came from dysfunctional backgrounds and or kids, and as they grew up, they followed them, and they found about a third of them were, having all kinds of problems, relational, mental, and this and that. About a third of them were functioning marginally, and about a third of them were doing really well. And the third that were doing well had two commonalities. One, they married a spouse from a healthy background so they could model off of that spouse a lot of those behaviors they didn't get as a kid, right? And number two, they had a success experience somewhere in their life. It might have been sports, it might have been a school subject, it, might have been a paper route or whatever, but somewhere in their life they had the concept that, well, I can succeed at least one thing, which then could bleed into other areas. So as an adult, that's really difficult. This is where if you can get them around people that are learning those things and they can model off of those people and see, well, this person has kind of broke out a little bit maybe, or give them some area within their life that they can be successful, that at least gets that started. Now there are some other techniques such as EMDR and eye movement desensitization processing. Some of those types of techniques can help as well, because they can help the person reframe some of those early childhood experiences, and those can be very useful.
So do you tell people to start saying no, or to start with a little no and then build into bigger no's? When we approach this idea of conflict, if we want to
Right.
get better at it, what would be your advice?
Well, again, if you're looking at the middle, the assertiveness approach, I have something that I teach, which is called the DER script, and that's how do you put your issue out on the table, right? And it's you request, express your thoughts or feelings. Excuse me. You describe the situation, the problem. You express your thoughts or feelings, and then you make your request. And typically, you need to start with a request. What do you want? Because you've probably been in a situation. I know I've been with couples, and somebody said, "Well, this person does that, and I don't like him with that. So, what do you want in this situation?" And then, I just can't stand it with that. And so, what would you like to have happen? Well, and then they do. And sometimes you can go 15, 20 minutes before the person finally settles down and says, "Well, here's what I want," right? So, the first step you need to think about is, what do I really want in this situation? And then you need to describe the situation to the person. And the two mistakes that people make with that is, one is they overgeneralize. You always, every time. And as soon as, let's take a very simple thing. You always make a mess. The person hearing that is just going to think, well, 2 years ago I picked up something. And so that negates everything else you said, right? So you need to be specific. I've come in the last few days, or when we go to the party, you were telling this joke about me or whatever. And you need to be very specific to time, place, and the behavior. And then if it's a close relationship where you have a bond, you can talk about feelings, right? Express your feelings, the E part. And it really makes me anxious, or it hurts me, or makes me angry. If you're dealing like with a business or with a friend or something that's less, then you go with thoughts. We would be able to get more things done, or I think it would be more efficient, things of that nature. And then you need to make your request, and the request needs to be specific. And this is the other thing that people don't do, is they don't say, when they're not specific. For example, when we go to the party, I want you to not tell funny stories about me. It embarrasses me and I don't like it. Now, of course, you have to have somebody reasonable who's going to respond to that, right? Otherwise, you need to get to the aggressive side, right? Which is,
Well, and I want to say very, 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 very strongly, in a healthy relationship, because I see a lot of women in the dating phase, and they think love is their partner playing guessing games to figure out what they want. And if there's a soulmate, then he will be able to interpret your needs and behavior to give you what you want without you having to ask for it, because you're uncomfortable asking for it. And that is a nightmare dynamic. Nightmare. Not fair for either party.
Yeah. Just a funny story about that. After I got married, the first Valentine's Day, cards are not important to me. Not that big a deal in my family. And the Valentine's Day came and went. And so about a week later, my wife came to me and she said, last week there was no card or anything for me. Next year there better be a card. She's gotten something every Valentine since then, right?
My husband, there was a time he was working a lot more and traveling for work. And I said, "Hey, you've been at business dinners all week. I haven't. When's our date?" Right? And it's like, you weren't trying to hurt your wife by a card. You weren't. He's been at business dinners all week. So he's thinking like, "Ooh, a good home cooked meal." And I'm thinking, I haven't been at business dinners. You need to
Yeah,
take me on
yeah,
a date,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And so then he's like, okay, I'll make reservations. And I was like,
yeah,
great. And I'll make a big breakfast the next day or a big Sunday dinner, right? And
yeah.
but it's not guessing games.
And in a reasonable relationship where the person has the capacity for intimacy and has the capacity to negotiate, and again, non-negotiators don't have those, right? And so
Right.
then this technique will not work. And that's the other myth about assertiveness. It does not work with everybody. This works when, again, when you have a person who's going to be reasonable and who is reasonably mature and has a realistic outlook on the world.
Have I told
People,
you my boundary story and the three little pigs?
you know,
Okay. So one little pig, because exactly what you're saying, people think, okay, I'm going to be more aggressive and it's
yeah,
going to change the non-negotiator's
right,
personality. Right? And I see people all the time trying to work on, I'm going to have boundaries. I'm going to work on it. I'm going to speak up for myself. And I said, okay. So one little pig had straw boundaries. One little pig had stick boundaries. Another little pig had brick boundaries.
mhm,
Which one of the pigs turned the big bad wolf into a sweet little fluffy lapdog?
mhm,
None of them.
right.
None of them, because boundaries do not change another person's personality,
That's right.
right?
That's right.
Boundaries are about protecting pigs, not changing wolves.
And that's why it has a door. You let in people that are safe and you keep out people that are not, right?
Right, right. Oh, we could talk forever. Tell
Yeah.
people where they can find out your book and find out more information about you.
Whyemotions.com. So whyemotions.com is the place to go. And there's links there to my YouTube channel. I have a lot of videos up on there and some freebie stuff there on the website as well.
Awesome.
Easy to remember. Whyemotions.com.
Easy to remember. And I know this is your second interview on the Toxic Person Proof podcast. So we'll definitely put your first interview in the show notes as well so you guys can
Yeah.
get more wisdom. Thank you again for talking conflict resolution, non
Yeah.
negotiators, and helping us become toxic person proof.
Yeah. Thank you.